Morning, everybody. Hope that you're feeling fresh and ready to learn after our mammoth day yesterday. My name is Ruth Lukabyo from YouthWorks College, Sydney, and I'm here to introduce some wonderful speakers this morning. Our keynote is Pete Ward. We're really excited to have him speak this morning. Let me tell you a little bit about Pete. He was a Christian youth worker in the Church of England for 15 years. He was an advisor to the Archbishop of Canterbury for 5 years. And now he's a professor of practical theology at Durham University. He's a very esteemed member of the association and a founder. And it's a real privilege to have him here to speak to us. He continues to really push us in terms of our theological thinking of youth ministry and the church. And I'm really looking forward to being pushed again today. And what a great way to start the day. I hope you're all going to buzz and wake up and enjoy this. So let's welcome Pete Ward.
Thank you. Is this, yeah, it's working, isn't it? That's great. Well, it's brilliant to be here. Thank you so much for letting me speak to you this morning. I suppose a disclaimer, I've not really been involved in researching youth ministry and youth ministry stuff for quite some time, and I'm certainly not nowhere near being a practitioner. So some of the things that I'll be talking about, I feel my time has been done, and it will be for others to take on. Having said that, I have a role at present in the Church of England's ministry training through Durham University. And that's involved me in various conversations and has made me aware of what's coming down the track for us all in this country. And I want to share some of that and then share some of my thoughts in the light of all of that. And yeah, so, I mean, the Church of England, my church in the UK, have developed this vision and strategy program where they want to grow the church younger. And as part of that, they've announced the intention that they want to train 30,000 youth and children's workers by 2030. And that there's an intention that they will, 10% of those will be paid either full-time or part-time. So we're looking at the possibility over the next few years of needing to facilitate training 3,000 odd people, maybe even more. And in terms of finances, the church has voted squillions towards it. There are others who know a lot more about this than I do here. Nick Shepherd is a good person to talk to if this interests you. But the fact is, wow. I mean, for those of us in this sector, this is an enormous change. I mean, when ISYM was starting and all the things, training of youth workers that we were involved with, Sally Nash is here, she's been involved all through those processes here. It's hard to believe the change. It really is hard to believe it. We would have to, I mean, goodness me, we've been on the margins for so long, and suddenly it's going to be right at the heart of everything. The only comparable thing is Norway, where they put loads of money into educating young people and have a national strategy, which we were hearing about yesterday. But this is a huge change for our sector. I was involved in setting up the very first youth ministry training course in the UK, I think, Oxford Youth Works, closely followed by a number of others. And we've had the Centre for Youth Ministry. And as those of you that have followed this area, we've also seen a lot of that close down. But the fact is, we've had 30 years of training youth ministers and having youth ministry education in England. But nevertheless, we're in such a dire strait in our churches that they're wanting to put millions in to put it right. In other words, all of our efforts as academics, meeting in places like this and running courses and training youth ministers for all the wonderful, amazing things that have come from it, we're still looking at, we're in a worse place now than we were 30 years ago. Now, I'm not an expert on the statistics, and the Church of England groups all of these and pores over them deeply. And again, you can ask Nick what the exact figures are. But the fact is, we really have very few young people and children in the vast majority of our churches, like none. And that's why the church wants to put money in it to turn it around. So before I say a few words about my thoughts about that, because it seems to me one of the things we need to be asking as a sector is we cannot assume, we can't just take all of this money and think we know what we're doing. That's the big thing. Maybe we have not known what we're doing. Maybe we've been training people the wrong way. Maybe there's more learning to take place. And as I begin to explore that, I want to talk about missiology very briefly. I wrote a book called Liquid Church, and a lot of the ideas in this paper come from Liquid Church. Liquid Church basically argues that instead of thinking about the church as a meeting, perhaps we need to be thinking about where people are finding spiritual life and energy beyond the life of the church, and that the missiological challenge is how we connect with that life and energy and build church with those people starting where they are, rather than an attractional model. How do we get them into the thing that we're running? And one way of beginning to think about that, which lay behind my work, was thinking in missiology, particularly the great Ghanaian theologian Lamin Sanneh. And in this book, Translating the Message, which I read very early on in training youth ministers, he makes this distinction between what he calls diffusion and translation. And diffusion is, he says, we have a cultural theological expression of the church and its gospel and its life, and we know what that is. And in places that are culturally coherent with the place where that expression of church is gathered, we can spread it. So we spread it unchanged in a way. However, when we're looking at culturally distinct environments, the challenge is what he calls translation. And at the heart of that is paying attention to the vernacular. And a lot of what I wrote about youth ministry was saying young people have a vernacular. How do we contextualize the gospel in their world and in their environment? So taking missiological thinking and applying it to this country. Now, another bunch of missiological thinking is represented by these two. And on the right, the church growth movement, Fuller, and all of that, Donald McGavran and then Peter Wagner, the notion that the way we spread the gospel is by planting churches. And we plant churches that are directed towards particular people groups. And I would say that the church planting model represents Sanneh's diffusion. notion. In other words, we know the way the church looks, we plant it. Leslie Newbegin, by contrast, I think, and Leslie Newbegin not as mediated through American-based missional theology, but Leslie Newbegin, when you read Leslie Newbegin, in other words, not Leslie Newbegin through Bart, which is what the Americans, I'm afraid, did to Newbegin. But Leslie Newbegin, I think, represents translation. How do we interact with our culture and translate the gospel in a contextual way that leads to a new expression of faith and new forms of church? Now, in my country, in a sense, I think there's been a moment where Newbegin was on the rise and ways of doing church based on Newbegin was there. But actually the people that went with Church Growth and Wagner have won the day. And everything that's being funded and is taking place is much more diffusion and Wagner than it is Newbegin. Now, that's not exclusively the case. There's some fantastic contextualized pioneer projects taking place, but on the whole, the mainstream direction has been towards church planting rather than pioneer missional movements of mission. Now, these ideas also lay behind the book that I wrote called Youth Work and the Mission of God, and the American version, God at the Moor, where basically I talk about two different approaches to youth ministry, one of which is a gathering of young people, the youth group, and that's attractional. You gather the young people and then you attract young people to it. The second is a more missional, contextual, relational approach, where you start where young people are and you try and express the gospel in their vernacular and you try and build church out of that first encounter. The one starts with gathering Christian kids, children of Christian parents. The other says, where are there bunches of young people that we can connect with? The one I would argue is diffusion, and the other is translation. So as I say, we've had 30 years, and some of those ideas I've said to you date back somewhere along that way. Why does the church feel so panicked? And it really is panicked, and it's in a mighty rush to do stuff, which is not a good environment to do things well. But what do we say? I think we're in the situation we're in because the youth group model has dominated. Basically, most people have adopted for diffusion rather than translation. Most church youth workers have been running groups for Christian kids with the hope that we will attract others. Relatively few have adopted a contextual missional approach. Now, given what I said to you earlier, that the vast majority of our churches have no children and have no young people, the basic premise of the church youth group model is not one we can any longer rely on in this country. But I suspect that we've been training people who've been employed by people whose assumption has been, we really want to see a youth group model. That missional, relational thing that I talked about in God at the Moor and so on, most people adopted the language, but they didn't do it, is what happened. Because the church group became the dominant mindset. And that's been what people have been doing. It's also worth saying that the relational approach to things, when people have done it, and there are wonderful examples of it, has often been very slow, small reward, takes loads of time. And so the church has found it hard to see the rewards of it. Thirdly, I think that we in this country have been dominated by the charismatic movement and worship being the main event. And so we've got generations of youth workers and young people and clergy who have only experienced encounter with God through sung charismatic worship. And they can't imagine meeting God any other way. And that part of the problem of that is it assumes diffusion. And actually, I've written also about the economic models that lie behind contemporary worship music. The economic models, the use of record companies, tours, bands, shows, all create a massive imperative towards diffusion. In other words, we want to sell the thing, make the thing bigger, tour the thing, get more units shifted, blah, blah, blah. And there's loads of money. A lot of you will have been around when people from the UK, including myself, have talked about youth church or fresh expressions of church, or we've had emerging church. I'm starting to feel that the word church, adding church to mission, has been a mistake. Because the people that run church are really not committed to contextualization and mission in quite the way that I would hope that we need to be. They're committed to diffusion. They know what church should be. They want to see it replicated. They love it as it is. And they've met God through it, and they see others meeting God through it. So there's not much motivation to think outside of what that model is. And for good reason, I think. That's part of the problem here is it's not good versus bad. It's good versus good, where the good that we've got has led us to a point where we've got to spend tens of millions. That's the point. It's not that something's bad. It's that we've been following this piece of string, but it's led us somewhere where now we might need to rethink. And I think one of the problems was beginning to talk about what we're doing as church killed off the missional side of stuff, actually. And it's interesting, the Church of England now is pulling the word mission into everything that it does about church. So the degree that I run as part of Durham University for all the Church of England colleges is a degree in ministry and mission. But the mission element of it is certainly not, I don't think, big time contextual in the way that I'm imagining it. Extraordinarily important thing. Most people that are advertising for youth workers in this country now say that they can't get one for love or money. And the reason, it's an interesting thing, 30 years of training youth ministers and there aren't any. So do they spontaneously combust? Well, what we know is that the church burns them. They don't spontaneously combust, the system kills them off. And so they go to be teachers or work in the secular field or become ordained. And so one of the things the church needs to fix are the way that we create a viable career and life for youth ministers. And thank the Lord, I'm hearing that voice from the church pretty clearly. I'm very encouraged by what I'm hearing. So my feeling is the millions will be wasted if as a sector, if those of us here in the UK and others that aren't here today go, just rub our hands and go, at last we can have all this money to do what we wanted to do. I think we'll be missing this moment, this opportunity. I think if we stick to our dominant ecclesiocentric models, i.e. the church youth group, the worship event, diffusion is the way that we do things, that we know what church should look like, I think the money will be wasted. If I'm honest, I think we'll just be back where we are, which is probably okay for all of us. We will have got to our retirement. But in terms of the church's ambition, my church, to grow itself younger and more diverse, we won't achieve that. And I think it's incumbent on us as the thinking element around youth ministry and practical theology. It's incumbent on us not to just sell our old stuff. As I said, a model that's based on gathering a group simply doing work, a group of Christian kids, that's what I mean. Of course you run with groups and you gather groups, that's not at all what I'm saying. But something that says we gather the Christian kids and then we attract, it won't work. I mean, just thinking about the northeast of England, where, you know, I don't know, there's probably only about 10 churches you could look at in my area that could start with a gathering group. That's out of hundreds. So the question is, what have we got to say to them as a sector, as the youth ministry professionals? What have we got to say to them? So I want to argue that the missional relational work is essential. We need to find a way to do those things. It's not for me to say how we do that, my time's gone. But I do think that's the way that we need to be going. But one thing to say about it is that those things will be more varied, and it will end up reshaping what the church is like. I think I'm coming to the end here. It's ecclesial. Probably my title beyond Ecclesiocentrism. I'm not getting rid of the church. I'm talking about the church in mission. Somebody mentioned modality, sodality. It's that kind of thinking that we need to be if we're going to be missional, part of the problem with putting church and mission together is that the church bit kills off the sodality bit. But if we talk about the church in mission, then suddenly that frees us up. It doesn't say everyone needs to change what they're doing and stop what we're about, but it's saying we need to invest in things that aren't sodality. Or is it modality? Modality. Yeah, that's as good as my inside out, outside in. So what I want to argue for is are models of youth ministry that are not ecclesiocentric, i.e. it starts from a centre that is a group. But nevertheless, ecclesia, church, is the direction towards which we hope to travel. But the way we get there is different than the way that we have been going. One thing to say is that the one spark of hope for the Church of England, I think, there's quite a lot of sparks of hope actually. Looking at all the ordinands coming forward yesterday at the graduation, I'm like, wow, the future of the church, this looks great. There are wonderful people giving their lives to train for the ministry that I'm seeing as I go around the theological colleges this year. St. Mellitus, I went to, great college where Mark's at. great people. But the one good thing that we have are church schools. And that is a place where a third of the population or something are in church schools at primary school level. And we have church connections. Anyway, I think I'm done. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I really feel like that's a wake-up call. And I'm really looking forward to Kenda's response, and particularly a different perspective, being from the US. So welcome, Kenda.
Yeah, so the biggest difference is we don't have a denomination putting its squigillions of dollars into youth ministry in any form, much less training. It is an honor to still be learning from Preet after 30 years. The first one of these organizations meetings that I came to, I somehow had discovered the book that became God at the Mall. Now my students are like, mall? What's a mall? But even before it had that title, I assigned it because I had discovered Pete Ward in the process of learning about this organization. I think the subtitle of Pete's paper today should be, if y'all had just listened to me 30 years ago, we wouldn't be here. So I am sympathetic to the question of whether that he's asking is whether the church should be the center of youth ministry for such a time as this. I was at a Youth Works conference a few years ago. I was speaking. They had about 1,000 youth workers at this conference, and there were a couple sessions, and in between the sessions, somebody came up to me and said, you're talking about youth ministry. Why do you keep talking about the church all the time? Young people aren't in churches. And I was like, oh man. First of all, I was like, remember where you are, right? But also there were 1,000 people there who were at a youth ministry conference. So I'm like, all right, well, if youth ministry is not in churches, who are all these people? And so I started paying attention to people's name tags. And yeah, there were lots of pastors there, but there were also teachers and social workers. And I remember a wrestling coach and some YMCA staff people, lots of people were imagining themselves in the role of a youth minister, which was something that began to shift the way I started thinking about youth ministry in the US too, in the directions that we are going to. In a lot of ways, we have spent 30 years looking at what has happened in the UK and seeing our own future kind of ahead of us. Now, that makes me hopeful that somehow we have some organization that's going to give the squigillion dollars to us. I doubt that, however. And really, I share Pete's hunch that money is not what will solve this problem. Anyway, in the US, and I think we are not alone, youth ministry is not primarily viewed as necessary because young people need Christ, right? Primarily, it's viewed as a defensive strategy. It's a form of saving the institutional church, right? It's a means of institutional survival. And what that means is we wind up doing a lot of vampire theology with young people, right? They are the young blood we need to survive. And so the question is money going to solve it? Maybe what we need is a different understanding of what the church is to begin with. And that kind of determines how we answer Pete's question. Maybe we need to listen to what God is calling us to be as a church differently. And so here are the questions that I'll lay out there, and then we can talk. First, I think it's really important and enchanting to think about the contextualization of youth ministry in terms of translation. I share your affinity with La Manzana, and I think this is a profoundly Jesus-y move, right? In John 20:21, as the Father has sent me, so I send you. In other the way that's translated is as the Father has sent me, in the same way as the Father has sent me. in human form as the Father has sent me, so in that same form I send you, right? But there are some risks with that I think we need to stay awake to. One is, what if we over-translate? What if we over-contextualize and in the process lose our identity with Christ? What if we're just too arrogant to notice God doing a new thing and we think we know what the church should look like for now and forever? And so we will do you the great favor of replicating it for you. What if eliminating discomfort or making church less challenging dilutes the cost of discipleship? Don't worry, this won't take much time. God wants you to be whatever you want to be. Or every religion is pretty much the same. Andrew Walls, who's a missiologist that I have been taken with for many years, believes that Jesus is alien in every culture. Doesn't do us any favors to dilute that in the name of contextualization. Sometimes the point is for us not to feel like we belong, to be different, to be set apart, to be holy. It's interesting that we're doing a lot of research at Princeton right now on young adults. And for us, that's the 20, in Europe, they're also called youth a lot of times, but for us, this is mostly 20-somethings. And it turns out that young people are pretty sensitive to wanting the church to preserve its sacred distinctiveness. Now, to be clear, they don't want to go to church, but if you're going to have a church, when you walk in, it better feel like church, you know? Something needs to happen there that sets it apart. And I think that's one of the reasons why, in the US at least, Eastern Orthodox congregations are growing in terms of young adults. Fascinating, right? Not because they're doing a lot of contemporary worship. Anyway, so the question I think we might want to ask is, how much do we need youth ministry to help contextualize the church? And how much do we need youth ministry to help re-weirdify it? The big question, of course, that Pete's asking is, should the church be the center of youth ministry? And I think it's true that youth ministry has always been an ecclesiology project. When you look at how you help young people become the body of Christ, there's your theology of the church laid out in front of you. We are Eli's to a whole lot of Samuels out there who, quite frankly, hear God calling the church into being in ways that we no longer hear. So Pete's question is, should youth ministry be ecclesiocentric? I think forces a more fundamental question that youth ministry is distinctly poised to ask. And that is, what do we mean by the church, right? And that suggests that if youth ministry can help the church ask that question, we have a far more fundamental role to play in the future of the church than just what we are doing with young people themselves. We are actually part of, I think, what God is up to in helping the church re-understand who we are to be for this particular, for such a time as this. Now, if the church, and this is the way you define it in the paper, Pete, is an organization, and I know why you do that because you're talking about the Church of England here, and you talk about it as a place that people hold meetings. It's a gathering of people in the same room, doing the same things with some allowances made for COVID. Then, of course, Pete is right. The church should not be the center of youth ministry. We should run from ecclesiocentrism. But that's not actually the church, is it? Right? The church is not an organization. It's an organism. That's why I'm inclined to say that if we really believe that the church is the mystical body of Christ, it absolutely should be the center of youth ministry, because Christ is the center of youth ministry. It means that youth ministry can't be reduced to a youth group or a worship event. That's more true in the UK than in the US, I think. Any more than you can reduce the church as a whole to what happens on Sunday mornings. When youth ministry reduces the theological church, capital C, to an organization or an event, right, then we've over-contextualized youth ministry. Maybe using church and mission interchangeably, maybe that's a mistake, but maybe it's absolutely necessary, because if we don't have mission, do we have a church? So the first time the word church is mentioned in the Bible, by the way, is Matthew 16. Jesus, of course, tells Peter, "You're the rock on which I will build my church," right? And in Greek, the word church, you know this, means assembly. But Jesus wasn't speaking Greek. who's speaking Aramaic or Hebrew. And in those languages, scholars think the most likely phrase that Jesus used meant, my body of witnesses. On you, Peter, I will build my body of witnesses, which kind of loosens things up a little, right? The point is the disciples have no concept of the church as an organization, right? There's no mention of meetings or even worship. Jesus never invited anybody to go to church. We know eventually these groups gathered and did those things, but that was the form the church took in that context. It was not its essence. Obviously, the body of witnesses has to have a form. It takes up space. And we learned on Wednesday night that place shapes our theology. It shapes the place, the shape of a youth group or educational program. The other trappings of the church liturgy does a lot of things, but none of them include forming faith. Youth groups, we've got data for this, right? Youth groups do a really good job of forming middle-class, moralistic, therapeutic deists. They're just a lousy way to form Christians. And to be clear, I have spent a whole career professionalizing youth ministry. I think we might need to relook at that word professionalization up there. We now have resources in youth ministry that would have made us in the 80s weep for joy, right? We are excellent at making youth part of religious organizations. We just suck at helping them become part of the body of Christ. And maybe that's because our ecclesiology just isn't that clear. So I'm for making youth ministry proudly, joyfully, passionately ecclesiocentric or ecclesial or whatever we want to call it. But let's know what we mean when we say we're talking about being the church. And put the body of Christ at the center of youth ministry instead of our meetings and our organizations. And let's please not use your squadrillions of dollars to do a better job forming middle-class, moralistic, therapeutic deists.
Pete, would you like to respond to the response?
Oh, no, you both of us. Let's talk.
Let's talk.